Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Freedman. He is Chris Allen, and we are here to do the Week 8 Fantasy Life live stream in which we will break down all of your fantasy football questions. I say all, it's not going to be all, but it's going to be a reasonable amount of your fantasy football questions because we don't want to give just like the surface level, like, hey, our rankings say this, so this is what we're saying. You asked a question, we try to give some context to the answer that we give. Chris, how's it going, man?
I'm doing well. No London game this morning, so we don't have to stop midway through and be like, okay, what questions are really relevant to what's going on right now? Maybe a quick stop in the action to make sure if any under bets are hitting. I mean, none of that. You guys have our full attention for the next hour to hour and a half. So fire as many questions as you can to us, and then we'll see what comes out afterwards, man.
Yeah, you mentioned it. No London game and no bye weeks. So it is the full-on slate that we have for Week 8. It felt weird, like in the off season when I would be looking at stuff, kind of like doing projections, getting a sense of the season. Like no bye weeks in Week 8. I don't know why the NFL schedule makers did that. I don't know what is so special about Week 8. I feel like maybe it has something to do with like the World Series is happening. And then it's also like the NBA season is starting. And maybe like the schedule makers were like, we need people to remember that the NFL is still happening this weekend.
That is right.
Like maybe something like that. But really, I have no idea. But we've got the full slate of games. And of course, we have questions coming in that we would love to answer. The first one, what up, fellas, from Devo Martzall. Hey, Devo. Pickens or Garrett Wilson? The Garrett Wilson thing is interesting. I would say the Garrett Wilson thing on its own would be interesting anyway, because you still have a Jets offense that is not anywhere close to what we would imagine is peak capacity. And then now he's dealing with a target hog opposite him in Devontae Adams. Good news for Garrett Wilson. Allen Lazard, doubtful for this game. So no Allen Lazard, annoyingly there to still targets. But of course, George Pickens, one of the guys that I highlighted in my Freedman's Favorites article, the wide receiver edition this past week. Love the situation that he has now with Russell Wilson, who has, I think, much more of a willingness to throw like those moon shots to him down deep. And Pickens just looked awesome last week on Sunday Night Football. So where are you, Chris, on thinking of Garrett Wilson versus George Pickens?
I will give the edge to Pickens here. I do think that even with Allen Lazard out, I get that. But in the same along the same lines, you just mentioned that Devontae Adams being there allows like some of the, not all of the targets to wind up going to George Pickens, or not George Pickens, like Garrett Wilson rather. And like Allen Lazard operates like on the interior parts of the field. That's where Garrett Wilson has been targeted like the least, at least like relative to where Adams has been targeted on the interior so far this season. So I do have like some concerns about whether or not Wilson is going to get some of those layup targets that would really help from a fantasy value standpoint. I mean, that's really like been his biggest issue so far throughout the earlier parts of the season, was the fact that he operates on the outside, isn't getting a lot of slot targets for at least a target rate from a target rate standpoint on the interior. Whereas George Pickens, it was great to see the Russell Wilson getting out there, using play action, hitting those shots downfield. The formula for success will be to get like Wilson out of the pocket, working the perimeter of the field, and that's where George Pickens does his biggest damage. So I give the lean to George Pickens, but it'd be great to see if Aaron Rodgers and the band can actually make this Jets offense a little bit more functional, but it's hard to see that like with them being so far behind like in the current standings in the AFC East.
Yeah. And I mean, you look at my rankings, I have Pickens at 14 and Wilson at 15. So this is one of those questions where it's neck and neck right there. I give the nod to Pickens, 9.9 yards per target for his career, like an elite number there. Number 3 this year with a 50% share of air yards. So, he's very important in that offense. And now with Russell Wilson, I feel like they will have a more competent passing attack overall, which I think is good things for George Pickens. All right, next question here from Heather Salerno. Shout out Heather, always in the chat here asking questions. Jordan Mason or Jahmyr Gibbs PPR. Jordan Mason has been dealing with some injury issues recently, but healthy. I don't think any question as to like whether he's playing in this game. I think the question is just maybe like, does he have the same workload that he had previously? And then also like one thing that has materialized with Jordan Mason is that he hasn't been nearly as effective on the goal line as Christian McCaffrey was. And so even though you would think of Jordan Mason as getting a lot of that Christian McCaffrey workload, he isn't converting those yards into touchdowns the way that McCaffrey did. So it's not as if it's like the one for one or the near one for one replacement. Of course, Jahmyr Gibbs has to deal with David Montgomery all the time. Last week Montgomery exited the game early with an injury, came back in, and that maybe resulted in some more goal line opportunities for Jahmyr Gibbs. But on a week-to-week basis, he has to deal with David Montgomery as someone who is more than capable of stealing touchdowns and stealing work. Where are you on Mason versus Gibbs?
In this particular matchup, I'll give the nod to Jordan Mason. Just give the fact that they're playing against your Cowboys. I know it's tough to bring up, but in the same sense that everybody's been able to run on the Cowboys so far, at least over the past 3 to 4 weeks. And so with Jahmyr Gibbs, I think the upside for him, I would say that in PPR, I can understand the case for him because of the suspension for Jameson Williams. Jahmyr Gibbs, his target rate was at least commensurate with some of the other higher end running backs so far this season. You can see on our utilization report comparison the UR score between the two. UR score of about 7.6 versus 7.5 for Jahmyr Gibbs. That puts you square into the low end RB1, high end RB2 range from a fantasy production standpoint. And so with Jordan Mason already getting all of the the goal line carries, and the hope would be that now the 49ers get back to what they do best from a play calling standpoint, being able to use more of the running back, featuring more of their running game, and then being able to hit shots downfield to keep the ball moving. So I give the lean to Jordan Mason, but with Jameson Williams suspension, David Montgomery also went down with that leg injury, came back to the game last week, so there is some injury concern with the backfield for Detroit. I can understand wanting Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think in this game I'll give it to Mason.
All right. Agree with you there, but I think because of the PPR factor, it's pretty close.
Yeah.
All right. Wes Fox with the question here: Chuba Hubbard or Tank Bigsby? All right. We've talked about, I feel like, Tank Bigsby a lot in the past couple of weeks, just as the guy who seemingly has really seized control of that backfield for the Jags the past couple of weeks. The Jags were in London, and so there's always the question with the early game: are you going with Tank Bigsby? In this situation now, Jags at home as underdogs, so maybe not as good of an overall game situation where you're going to have Tank Bigsby kind of piling on the carries, and he's not much in the receiving game. And so if the Jags are at a deficit in this game and Bigsby isn't much of a pass catcher, that means he might kind of get shut out a little bit from opportunities. Of course, Chuba Hubbard, big underdog on the road going against a really tough Broncos defense. But Chuba Hubbard really locked in as the guy for that backfield. And now with the switch back to Bryce Young, you figure maybe they lean even more on Chuba Hubbard and the running game for the overall Panthers offense. Where are you leaning in this one?
I'll go with the Jaguars offense as a whole. They do have the stronger matchup going against going up against Green Bay. I know that they just put limited CJ Stroud's output. What was it, 86 yards or something along those lines just this past week. But at least for Tank Bigsby's outlook, Joe Mixon actually did fairly well from a rushing production standpoint. And using our DVP metric that we also have on the site, go over to the utilization tab. And I think it's under fantasy stats. Right now, Green Bay ranks as the 13th best in terms of against running backs right now from a fantasy production standpoint, around 22-ish PPR points per game. Whereas for who is he going to go against? Who is the other one?
Tank Bigsby.
Oh, Tank Bigsby going against the Broncos. Yeah, all the way down to around 20th, 21st. So we already know the switch back to Bryce is going to limit the offenses from an efficiency standpoint. So it's easier for me to go with the Jags offense in the hopes that they get it together. Offense is actually able to put together a strong game. Guys aren't catching touchdown passes one step out of bounds, things of that nature. I'll give it to Bigsby.
Yeah. In my rankings, I have this super close: Chuba at 24, Bigsby at 27. I have the slightest lean to Chuba, but not a strong lean there. All right. Next question here from TB12BB6. Love that one. All right. PPR wide receiver 1. sorry, one wide receiver, one flex, one running back. David Montgomery, Kareem Hunt, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, and then a question about quarterback as well. Cousins, Mayfield, or Nix. Let's start with the quarterbacks first and then work our way back to the questions about the other position players. Cousins, Mayfield, or Nix. You have Cousins, sorry, I'm looking
Bucks.
here. Yes, that's right. So you have Cousins and Mayfield going against each other. Decent matchup for Cousins, but again, like Cousins outside of that one game he had against the Bucks a few weeks ago, where he looked awesome, he hasn't really looked like his former self, still working his way back into it. Of course, Mayfield has a matchup now where he has no starting wide receivers really to speak of, or missing the two main wide receivers that he normally is going to. Bo Nix, a guy that I highlighted in my quarterback piece this week, absolutely love the matchup for him that he has going against the Panthers. And of course, he's got, I think, an underappreciated rushing ability as well, which I think gives him a higher floor. So it sounds kind of disgusting. And ordinarily, I really wouldn't be thinking, hey, I want to start Bo Nix this week. But you have Nix at home with 3 extra days of rest and preparation, and at home where the Broncos have true home field advantage at elevation with a great matchup. I would be going with Bo Nix.
I would agree with you there. I know that Cousins provides the higher ceiling, but if you're starting off completely 0-0, you didn't wind up facing Puka Nacua from Thursday, Justin Jefferson, any of those other guys that played and did well just this past Thursday, and you're not finding yourself in a hole. I think Bo Nix provides at least the floor and potential ceiling with the fact that they're playing against the Panthers that have allowed at least 2 passing touchdowns over the past 3 weeks. So I would give the lean to Nix, but I mean it's kind of wild that that's where we're at in just 2 months into the season, that Bo Nix starting quarterback over Baker Mayfield, Kirk Cousins, those types of guys. But I mean, of course, 2024 regular season, we can't expect anything worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have Nix at number 11 and Cousins at number 12. So it's not like it's a slam dunk. But at the same time, even though I have them ranked right next to each other, I'm pretty strongly going with Bo Nix just because he has the running ability. And then I just absolutely love that matchup that he has. Shout out Greg D. Let's get some likes, slackers. Yes. In that live stream, let's get some likes. Hey, Nando, let's go back to the previous question that we had there, because we hit the quarterbacks, but we didn't hit any of the positional questions that our fella had. I think it was Montgomery, it was Kareem Hunt, it was Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas.
Yeah.
So let's start with the running back first. If you're going Monty or Kareem Hunt, I'm leaning towards Kareem Hunt in this situation. Love the spot for him. Even though the Chiefs are on the road, they're still favored by 8.5, 9 points. So good spot for them. And think about it, just over a month ago, Kareem Hunt was an afterthought. He was a free agent available for any team to sign. The Chiefs, needed some running back help. They made the smart decision, and now he's the number 1 running back for the league's last undefeated team. And since he was elevated from practice squad to the active roster, that was in week 4, 285 yards, 3 touchdowns on 63 carries and 6 targets. And even though last week the team had available Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who had returned from the reserve list, even though they had him available, Kareem Hunt was still awesome last week. 63% of the rush share, 47% route rate, 100% of the team's goal line carries. So he is locked in as the guy. And then there's the matchup against the Raiders, who are number 3 and largest fantasy boost allowed to running backs. If you look at our running back DVP tool, you can see not only how many points a team allows to a specific fantasy position, but you can also see what that really means in terms of how teams normally do, and then how teams normally do against that team. And so you can see the fantasy boost or the fantasy deficit that a defense allows. And the Raiders, number 3 in fantasy boost allowed to running backs. And of course, they're missing their defensive tackle, Christian Wilkins. So massive favorite, Kareem Hunt. Could have 20 plus opportunities in this game once again. And then just kind of on the side, I feel like stuff like this is relevant. Head coach Andy Reid has historically dominated in division, especially even on the road. On the road in division, Andy Reid is 22-10 against the spread, 27-6 on the money line in this spot against divisional opponents on the road. And Dwayne McFarland in his piece highlighted this. Kareem Hunt is the focal point of the Chiefs offense. And even though that feels kind of disgusting, that is the fact. So I'm going with Kareem Hunt over David Montgomery when we're choosing for that running back spot.
I agree on that one. And then between the Malik Neighbors versus Brian Thomas Jr., I think like for the Giants going up against Pittsburgh, it looks like a tougher matchup, but we do know that Malik Neighbors has that diverse route tree, is used on the outside and on the interior. I think where Brian Thomas Jr. has been more of the team's like primary X receiver, it does set him up for a tougher matchup. So I would, even though that it looks like it would be a game where Daniel Jones is going to be under duress quite a bit, TJ Watt, like the whole thing, I would give the edge to Malik Neighbors for that one. So I'd go Kareem Hunt and Malik Neighbors out of that group. We had to start one running back, one wide receiver. So I'd go there.
Yeah, with you there. And then it's a question of flex. Do you go Montgomery or do you go Brian Thomas? And I feel like we've had questions like this before on the show where it's like, are you maybe chasing the solid floor of the running back or maybe the higher ceiling of the wide receiver? I would go with David Montgomery. The dude feels like a near lock every week to score a touchdown. So that gives you a really high floor. And then, of course, you have the Lions against the Titans. Lions favored at this point now by 11.5 points, a slate high 11.5 points. And so I think you could have an opportunity where Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, who we talked about earlier, both of them get a lot of work, especially in the second half of the game, as the Lions are just kind of looking to put this one away. And Montgomery has a really good chance of scoring a touchdown. So I would go with Montgomery over Brian Thomas in the flex.
I would agree on that one. And the touchdown streak, which ended this past week when they played Minnesota, but he had one going all the way back to, it was like week 15 of last season. He had scored a touchdown in every single game. So yeah, the dude's a beast.
All right. From Jose Hernandez. Good morning, fellas. All right. Thanks for all the advice. You are welcome. Hello, Jose. All right. Question. I need help. I need two. Darnell Mooney, Xavier Worthy, Tank Bigsby, worried about negative game script playing from behind. We talked about that earlier. And then Rashad Bateman. So we need two of these guys. Darnell Mooney, we have seen the role that he has within that Falcons offense. Xavier Worthy, who can take really any touch for a touchdown, but he hasn't really gotten the workload that we would have wanted or expected. And then now there are questions about with DeAndre Hopkins coming onto the team, how big of a workload is Xavier Worthy really going to have? Tank Bigsby, Jose mentioned this, the potential workload concerns with the negative game script. And then Rashad Bateman, who could also have kind of potential workload concerns with the Ravens favored by so many points. Maybe they just run the ball a lot, and that means very few target opportunities for everyone on the Ravens. So something to think about there. We need two. Where are you starting here?
So out of that group, I mean, I can understand the concerns there. I mean, Bateman also feels like kind of fluky as well. I mean, over like 50% of the team's air yards just this past week. There's a sense of optimism about Zay Flowers also being available for this game. So I think if Zay Flowers were to sit, I would be a bit more on Bateman. So I can remove him from the equation. You talked about the concern for Xavier Worthy. I'm at least willing to put him in for just this 1 week. I think this, if you go to our utilization, like the game logs that are available, so you can see how each player's usage is on a week-to-week basis. Like week 7 was one of the higher target shares, like for Xavier Worthy, 32% target share just this past week. Like his utilization score did also tick up. So I'm willing to give it 1 week and see like how things look with DeAndre Hopkins coming in. We do know that like Hopkins has been battling through the MCL like sprain or like partial tear, something along those lines. So his first week like with the Chiefs, like while it is going to be something to watch for, I don't think we can just necessarily assume he's going to be plugged in and like almost like Devontae Adams in his first week with Aaron Rodgers. So I'm willing to give like Xavier Worthy at least like 1 more week and see if he can get back on the same track as Patrick Mahomes. And at least for some of the other guys, like who are the other options that were?
So Darnell Mooney and Rashad Bateman.
Okay. Yeah, Bateman I'm less in on. Bigsby I'm still willing to, even with the negative game script, the workload should be there for him. So I give the nod to those two.
Yeah, I go Bigsby, just kind of right off the top, and then out of the 3 wide receivers, Mooney, Worthy, Bateman. Mooney is the guy whose usage within that offense I feel the most comfortable with, and also that is the game that is the closest. Xavier Worthy. The Chiefs favored by 9.5. Rashad Bateman, Ravens favored by 8.5. Both of those teams might end up getting pretty run heavy. You have the Falcons favored by only 2.5. So that game could stay pretty close, which means I think we could see them throwing the ball a little bit more with a kind of more of a balanced approach there. So those are the 2 I would go with.
Question for you though on the whole, like Falcons being favored by 2.5, with them losing Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, did this seem like kind of a funky line to you at first glance? I would think that with both like your primary receivers like being taken down, Baker Mayfield not having to work with like Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard, I mean instantly like K-Dot and like those types of guys, I would have thought that would have been a much wider spread than just seeing like 2.5 points. Or does it make sense to you from a betting standpoint?
It does make sense. So on the look ahead lines, this number was like 2.5 favoring the Buccaneers at home. And then on Monday Night Football, right? It was Monday Night Football, correct?
Yeah.
Right. On Monday Night Football, the Bucs lost both of their wide receivers. And so the line flipped all the way.
Completely flipped on the other side. Okay.
Yeah. And so given where the line initially was to where it has moved now, it's a move that makes sense. And if it hit 3, because 3 is such a key number in the NFL, I think there would be resistance that would come back and would bet on the Buccaneers. And so like, I think it makes sense that it's basically stayed at 2.5 that whole time, because that's just sort of where the market has gone with it.
Okay.
Yeah, a good question. Waddle or Dell in full PPR. So love this. We haven't talked about Waddle or any of the Dolphins yet. The Dolphins have been, to this point, an absolute train wreck without Tua Tagovailoa there to take snaps under center. Now Tua coming back off of IR from the concussion, you would expect, and the market is kind of acting as if we are going to see that Dolphins offense fully restored. And so if that's the case, Waddle is super intriguing, but then you have Tank Dell within that Texans offense. Tank Dell didn't do really anything last week, but he has opportunities within an offense that is pretty explosive and is missing this number 1 wide receiver. So you have 2 number 2 wide receivers right here going against each other. I go with Jalen Waddle just because we've seen what he can still do within that offense, even though he's a number 2 receiver, what he can do when he has his quarterback healthy. Tank Dell, he should be getting a decent workload with no Nico Collins, but without Nico Collins, that offense is kind of cratered. And so maybe that's just bad news all around for the wide receivers who are remaining, even though theoretically they should be getting more work. So I'm going towards Jalen Waddle. What do you think, Chris?
I'd also lean towards Jalen Waddle. I think the positives for Waddle, like even without having Tua Tagovailoa in the offense, was that the targets were starting to condense around both him and Tyreek Hill. You go all the way back to week 1, Tyreek Hill was around like a 30% target share in that single game. I mean, essentially like proving out like why folks were drafting him like 2nd or 3rd overall, like in their drafts to start off the season. And like Waddle was more down in like the 15 to 20% like target range, like a wide separation between the two. But without having 2 on the field, like those are started to condense, both around like 20, 25, like somewhere in there. Like, of course, now with Jonnu Smith also getting some work. So if Waddle is also getting the workload and now has the quarterback upgrade, I would give the lean like to a guy like Waddle. But I understand like the optimism for Tank Dell. Last couple of like functional offenses with perimeter wide receivers that the Colts have faced, it was like Brian Thomas Jr. a couple weeks ago went for 8, 122 and 1. George Pickens also dunked on them for 113 yards. So I get why like putting somebody like Tank Dell out there, because he can be that explosive player that can take like a just either a deep shot down the field to the house or things of that nature. But I guess with like the Miami Dolphins being like back to normal, at least that's the hope. And also like Tyreek Hill coming in with that DMP like late in the week with that foot injury, I think Waddle is probably the better option between those two.
Oh man. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned the Tyreek Hill injury, because I totally forgot about that. Yes, we are projecting Tyreek Hill to play. I think it's tentatively expected that he is going to play. I have him ranked number 5 overall, but there is actually within the realm of how all of this could shake out. There is a non-zero chance that either Tyreek Hill is in an active, or he gets out there and doesn't make it through the contest, or is limited, or whatever. And so to contextualize the Tyreek Hill injury, right? It's a foot injury. He practiced fully on Wednesday, no injury at all. On Thursday was limited, and then on Friday did not practice, and then is listed as questionable. Almost always when you see that kind of pattern in practice, a dude is out, right? Normally, if it's full practice, limited practice, did not practice, normally a guy is not playing. And so the only reason why we are expecting Hill to play is just because of some like optimistic beat reporter statements. There hasn't been anything saying that like Hill is not going to play, but like I would keep an eye on this, because it would not surprise if like get closer to kickoff, there's some sort of statement that comes out about like, oh, expect Hill to be limited or whatever it is. So yeah, I would go with Waddle.
I'm surprised that hasn't gotten a bit more run, at least from a media standpoint. I know the T. Higgins like quad injury has been like the larger talk of the town, just because like the history of T. Higgins, like soft tissue injury, so on and so forth. But like with like Tyreek Hill being such a prominent wide receiver, and with the expectation for this Dolphins offense like being back to normal, like him having that DMP on Friday, I thought that would have been a bit more of a storyline. But it just seems like it's been, oh yeah, he didn't practice, foot injury, but he'll be all right. We'll see him on Sunday, and it's a ho hum. We'll see him back out on the field on Sunday. Just seemed kind of odd.
Yeah. All right, Jaden Daniels or Joe Burrow. And so I will say the Jaden Daniels thing. Have we gotten confirmation? Like, are we fully expecting him to play, Chris? Or is
signs are like, at least the indications were that he was going to be able to play. I mean, they didn't call up, was it Sam Carson, or I forget who the fourth string, like, or third or fourth string, like quarterback. He didn't get called up. So, and there was at least some optimism that he was going to play, but there is no like singular report saying he is definitely going to play.
Okay. So that's one we just have to monitor. And let me kind of look at the schedule. Commanders are playing in the early window of games at 1 p.m. So at least you will not have to be making a decision based on like the time constraints. Burrow playing in the afternoon. But yeah, so Jaden Daniels or Joe Burrow. I would say we get confirmation Jaden Daniels is healthy. He's like a top 5 quarterback, like at a minimum. And then Joe Burrow, love Joe Burrow. Right now I have him ranked number 5. But if Jaden Daniels is healthy, Daniels is going to be slotted ahead of him. If you have concerns about potential for injury with Jaden Daniels exiting the game early, anything like that, I would go with Burrow, because I think they will be very close. I think they will be like kind of neck and neck in terms of where I have them ranked. So if you have concerns for injuries, anything like that, I would go with Burrow. If you feel pretty good about Jaden Daniels, and maybe you're like a little bit of an underdog in your matchup, and it's just like, hey, I need a guy who can score a ton of points, I would go with Jaden Daniels. But I think it's a little more kind of like, you have to look in the mirror and say like, how risk averse do I want to be with this decision? How much risk do I want to seek with this decision, and go from there?
I'm with that. And also Chicago, they have at least allowed like some like mobile quarterbacks to get by them. Trevor Lawrence this past week, or no, like 2 weeks ago, because they were on bye. Like he got by like Chicago, like 4 for 17, like if memory serves. Like they've played against like some guys that have been, and they not like they played against like, because they didn't face like they played the Colts, but I think that's when Anthony Richardson was down. So they haven't really played against like an actual like legitimate like running quarterback, at least along the same lines as Jaden Daniels. So we can't really say for certain whether or not like Daniels will be able to at least get around like their front 7 or anything like that. But I think on the injury, or on the secondary side of things, I do think at least one of their starting corners is supposed to be out this week. I forget if it's Brisker or not, like which one is supposed to be out. At least one of their secondary like defenders should be out. So at least that allows the passing game to still be able to operate. So I'm with you. I think if Jaden Daniels is playing, and you also feel like you need that punch on your roster, I would start Daniels. And even if T. Higgins winds up sitting out, I do think that Burrow like should at least be considering that top 5, top 6 range. But I think just, again, given the rushing component to Daniels, you have to at least give him at least the slightest of edges for week 8.
To your point about some injuries there, you have Kyler Gordon, slot corner, who is out for the Bears, and also strong safety Jaquan Brisker, who is out.
Is
So
Briscoe's out? Okay.
yeah, so two of the starting five in the secondary are out. So overall, good situation there, and attacking that matchup. All right, the next question that we have here from Anthony Tong: Marvin Harrison Jr. or Chris Olave? So you have Harrison going against the Dolphins. The Dolphins, if memory serves, are one of the worst teams in the league in terms of DVOA against number one wide receivers. So pretty good matchup you have there for Harrison. Of course, there are always the concerns about Kyler Murray and his ability to facilitate for people within that offense. And then Chris Olave, theoretically good situation in that there's no Rashid Shaheed. So maybe you see more target volume going towards Olave. But of course, the defense can maybe focus on him a little bit more because there's no Rashid Shaheed. And the big thing, no Derek Carr throwing the ball to him. Instead, he has rookie Spencer Rattler. Spencer Rattler throwing to him, which is a significant downgrade. If you go to the quarterback against the spread value chart that we have at Fantasy Life, there is, I believe, a 3.5 point difference in terms of value to the spread between Derek Carr and Spencer Rattler. So pretty big downgrade overall to the whole offense. And I feel like we've seen that play out on the field the past couple of weeks. Where are you going between Marvin Harrison and Chris Olave?
So I was going to go, I'm leaning towards like MHJ, and I'm pulling up this. I've actually never used this before. This is actually really interesting, like seeing how different, like going from like one quarterback to the next. And then to your point, if we scroll all the way down, like where is it?
If you go up to the top, it's actually, so you don't see.
Yeah, there it is.
So there's a thing like with some rookies who are like backups and just coming in. There's like an issue where it actually doesn't list their name. But yeah, Derek Carr 3.5 points against the backup who's coming in.
Very interesting. Huh. Wow. Yeah, that's not great. But no, coming into this, I was thinking more along the lines of trying to at least try and shoehorn Marvin Harrison Jr. like into this conversation, or at least like between those two, because the way that Kyler Murray has been playing and the types of routes that Marvin Harrison Jr. has been running, they're just like, they're incongruent, not really conducive to like fantasy production, because Marvin Harrison Jr. has the higher ADOT. Kyler Murray, like whether it's the offensive line conditions that he currently has, not being able to look at some of those longer developing routes, like they're just not on the same page. So if you were to tell me that OC Drew Petzing has really taken that into consideration, wants to use MHJ on more slants, more like quicker routes, like quicker developing routes, getting him like across the middle of the field, then yes, I will take Marvin Harrison Jr. over Chris Olave. But even with the quarterback downgrade, we do know that Rattler is willing to like at least push the ball downfield and be aggressive, sometimes to his own detriment, like causing turnovers. But I would say that from a target volume standpoint, if I don't have to worry about that with Olave, we do know that the quarterback wants to be aggressive. I think I would give the edge to Olave in this one, because we just don't know how well or how much like MHJ is going to be used, at least in comparison to Trey McBride, Greg Dortch, even James Conner getting also mixed into the passing game, or at least in the areas of the field that don't require Kyler Murray to run, buy time like 2, 3, 4 seconds, and then uncork one down the field to Marvin Harrison Jr.
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier. Great matchup for Marvin Harrison Jr. The Dolphins are number 31 in defensive pass DVOA against number 1 wide receivers. But of course, Chris Olave going against a Chargers defense that is without its number 1 cornerback, Asante Samuel. So I feel like in terms of matchup, still, like better than you would maybe expect for both of those guys. I have Olave. If you're looking at the ranks here, I have Olave like one spot, literally just one spot, 27 ahead of Marvin Harrison at 28. So the slightest of leans towards Chris Olave, but I would say like if you have a particular feeling about one of these two, I would just lean into that. Slightest of leans for me on Olave. All right, question here from Quinn Ashworth. Oh, by the way, so we are 35 minutes into the show. If you are just now joining, welcome. I'm Freedman. He's Chris Allen. We're running through your fantasy football questions. If we do not get to one of your questions, sorry about that. Check out the start sit tool that we have for free at Fantasy Life. Check out the rankings we have for free at Fantasy Life. A slew of rankers in there. My stuff is in there. Dwayne and Ian, Waz, Charch, all 5 of us have rankings in there. And then, of course, with the Fantasy Life Plus subscription, you can get the projections that we have, the player projections that we have for all of these guys on the site. Dwayne manages the projections on the site, and then I also have my own projection set on there as well. Be sure to check all of that out. All right. Question from Quinn: start, flex, bench, Sutton, D-Hop, Marvin Harrison. So we talked earlier about Marvin Harrison. We mentioned DeAndre Hopkins in passing when we were talking about Xavier Worthy, and then Cortland Sutton. Haven't mentioned him yet, but talked earlier about Bo Nix and how much I love his matchup. Sutton at home is a big favorite going against a Panthers defense that is entirely decimated. How are you looking at these 3 guys? Who are you starting? Who are you flexing? And which one of these 3 is on the bench?
So I'd be willing to start. Let's see. So I'd be willing to start Marvin Harrison, just given the usage so far, and predicated on this idea that we were talking about just a minute ago about it. They're going to try and change how he's being used, get him on some more short and intermediate targets. I'm willing to flex Cortland Sutton, just given the matchup against the Panthers, and I'm willing to sit DeAndre Hopkins first week with the Chiefs. I think that's where I'm at. Do not know how much he's going to get quickly integrated into this offense again in his first week. Do not know, and we talked earlier about Kareem Hunt being the focal point of the Chiefs offense, especially once they get into the red zone and once they get closer to the goal line. I think that's how I'm leaning towards this, for this week. But happy to be wrong about DeAndre Hopkins, but we just don't have a clear idea of how much he's going to be used in this offense, in his first week.
Yeah, strong agree on that, with Harrison as the guy that I'd say off the top automatically slot in. And then it's a question between Hopkins and Sutton. I lean towards Sutton in part because of the matchup, then also just massive unknown with DeAndre Hopkins and how he's used within that offense in general, and then how he's used within that offense in his first week with the team. There could be a significant ramp up period. And with the Chiefs, big favorites, they might not really need to rely on DeAndre Hopkins that much in this game anyway. So yeah, I would be benching DeAndre Hopkins. All right, a question here from Gabriel: Tony Pollard or Najee Harris? Haven't mentioned either one of these guys yet on the show. Najee Harris, pretty sure he's one of the guys that I wrote up in my article this week looking at running backs. Really good situation. Did I write him up? Yes, I did. It was a brief note. Good situation for him going against the Giants. I believe that game is Monday Night Football. And so there are kind of the questions of, do you hold a player over for Monday Night Football? I like the spot for Najee Harris. He has at least 70 yards on 16 opportunities in every game over the past 2 weeks. He's really looked the best that he's maybe looked at any point in his career, just in terms of explosiveness, vision. 224 yards, 2 touchdowns on 35 carries and 3 targets over the past 2 weeks. I think he gets a similar workload this week as a big home favorite. Steelers favored by 6.5 points on Monday Night Football. So I do like the spot for Najee Harris. And then there's the question of going against Tony Pollard. The Titans, as we have mentioned earlier on the show, going against the Lions. Titans on the road, big underdogs. It's a spot where I could just see Tony Pollard, I wouldn't say getting phased out, but just how effective is he able to be? And then got a really tough matchup going against the Lions run defense. So I lean towards Najee Harris. But what are your thoughts on this one?
I would agree with you there. I mean, if I get it, the Lions, they're going to be missing Aiden Hutchinson in this one, but there is that concern for him getting phased out. Now he does have, if this were a PPR scoring league, I can understand maybe from a floor standpoint, Pollard getting mixed in. I mean, obviously no DeAndre Hopkins. Calvin Ridley was also on the injury report. I think he also was nursing some a foot injury, had a couple of DMPs also throughout the week. So there is some concern about how that target share is going to look, but it's Mason Rudolph throwing him the ball. So I would assume for Tony Pollard's standpoint, he should be able to hit him on some of the shorter dump off routes that Tony Pollard would get. But I'm with you. I think Najee Harris does have the stronger matchup. for this week. And even if it is like in one of the primetime games, and you'll have to wait and see like what your matchup's going to look at, or wait for Najee to play. Compared between the two, I think it's like the Titans offense isn't one that I want to at least put my hopes on from a fantasy standpoint, even if some of those targets, even some of the like increased opportunities might come to Tony Pollard. And we haven't even heard word, like, is Tajay Spears going to play or not? Because the last I heard, he was questionable for this week. So we can't even assume that Tony Pollard is going to get most of those targets anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Spears, not a certainty in terms of whether he's in or out. And so I would be going with Najee Harris in this spot. And I just say, like, think of like maybe the downside scenarios. Like, which one of these guys is likelier to just lay a total egg? I feel like it is probably Pollard, just because of the circumstances. Like, I think in terms of like his ability, he's looked good this year, but the offense that he's in is really debilitated, and they've got a tough matchup as big road underdogs versus Najee Harris, who maybe doesn't have as high of a ceiling, but has a really high floor. And then I would also say circumstantially probably does have a high ceiling because his offense looks better than it had previously, and he's a home favorite. So
I agree with that.
Yeah. All right. Shout out Gabriel for asking that question. All right, next question here from Jason Burns. We got Rome Odunze or Cedric Tillman. Yes, we have reached the Cedric Tillman portion.
I was waiting for that
of
question.
The show. Yeah. And so with Amari Cooper no longer on the Browns, last week we saw Cedric Tillman as the kind of in-house replacement, not necessarily in terms of like target volume, but in terms of guy who is now out there playing more snaps, running more routes because of the vacated opportunity there. And so Cedric Tillman, I thought, actually did a pretty good job. And he was like, he's the guy that I wrote up as my sort of like last wide receiver in my article this week. 82% route rate last week. That's what he had with Amari Cooper now gone. And with that enhanced usage, he had 12 targets. I mean, that's a lot. He had an 8.2 utilization score in week 7. 81 receiving yards is what he had on 8 catches. The Ravens, number 1 in most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, 35.6 and a half PPR format. And you can see that in our DVP tool with wide receivers. And then number 1 cornerback Marlon Humphrey exited last week with a knee injury. And so, going against a secondary that allows quite a bit of production, and it makes sense that they allow a lot of production given that their offense is so prolific. And then now, of course, going against a secondary that it will very likely be without number 1 cornerback Marlon Humphrey, who is doubtful to play in this game. And then also could be without backup cornerback Nate Wiggins, who is dealing with a shoulder injury and an illness. Right. So I think a good spot for Cedric Tillman, but then of course, Rome Odunze, in a situation where he's going against a Commanders defense that is pretty suspect, and his quarterback has looked better and better each week. Bears coming out of a bye, that offense can maybe be even better than what we've seen. So the question of Cedric Tillman versus Rome Odunze, I'm more interested in Tillman, but where are you?
I am a bit more interested in Cedric Tillman, not just because of the let's say the quarterback upgrade with Jameis Winston, but I would at least say that Cedric Tillman did show like a higher like route diversity, at least compared to Jerry Jeudy. Jeudy primarily used like on the perimeter. I know that's where like he'll like likely would have seen a guy like Marlon Humphrey on the outside being able to beat him deep. But Cedric like Tillman was used on like slants, like intermediate hitches, like deep post. I mean, he was getting all of the routes and coming down with the ball. Jerry Jeudy also credited with at least like 1 drop, like once Jameis went in. So I do have like a bit more interest in Tillman, and like Odunze with Keenan Allen coming back. We've seen his like target share like start to wane. It's been like popped up and down. I think he went from around like a 20-ish% target share. Keenan Allen comes back, it's down to 15%. Going into their bye was even less than 10%, like with everybody like back into the mix. So I can see a scenario where it's DJ Moore going up at like against Washington, him getting like most of the work. We saw Cole Kmet just get in the box like twice just this past week. So comparing the two, like Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, I mean, and David Njoku, I mean, those are going to be your primary options like for the Browns this week with Jameis Winston. Whereas the weapons at the disposal of Caleb Williams. I mean, we can list like 3 or 4, haven't even discussed the running backs also getting involved. So I think it's easier for me to see a path to Tillman getting targets like versus Adunze.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think, Tillman, very good chance to out-target Rome Odunze in this spot. I have them projected very close. As a staff, we give the nod to Tillman in terms of just like where we have him ranked. So, I would go with Tillman over Odunze. All right, what's your approach to Deebo? Good question here. So we've got Deebo playing on Sunday Night Football. And so, you kind of have to ask yourself questions about guys who have some injury designation entering that game. I can start Marvin Harrison Jr. or Tony Pollard, who play early. If I wait and Deebo is out, I'm stuck dropping Jonathan Brooks for guys like Pearsall and Jalen Warren. Okay. What is your initial thought on Deebo Samuel here? Like, I will just kind of set it up a little bit more. I am assuming that Deebo ends up playing in this game, but it's not like ironclad by any means. So what are your thoughts here?
I'm more of like, I think he's going to play. Is he going to play like the full complement of snaps? I don't think so. And is he going to be more of the being used sparingly? So if he's going to be used in like third down situations, like they need to have it and like can convert the series, I can see him being used there. Is he going to be, I don't think he's going to be used as like a rusher out of the backfield, like not the full like Deebo type usage. So I would at least like tick him down a bit from like needing to have him like in my starting roster. Whereas I don't really have those concerns with Marvin Harrison Jr. So I would lean more towards the guys that we know are going to be healthy, even despite having like, let's say, poor matchups like we were discussing earlier, like for Tony Pollard and those guys. Whereas for Deebo, it's just, I don't know how many stories I've heard throughout this week of other fantasy analysts like talking about having pneumonia and how long it's taken them to get over it. I get it that professional athletes get better health treatment than all the rest of us, but it's just as like in 1 week after being hospitalized and fluid in his lungs, it's just hard. I'm hard pressed to believe that he's just going to be out there doing the same things that we saw him doing when he was like scoring that 76-yard touchdown against the Seahawks just a few weeks ago. It's too difficult for me to envision that type of scenario for him. So I'm willing to let him rest at least on my bench. Like he might be out there in the field like doing some cardio work, but I'm willing to let him rest on my bench for 1 week.
That's fair. I mean, looking at the rankings right now, I have Deebo at 16. I have Marvin Harrison at 28. Like that to me is sufficient enough of a difference to where like all things being equal, I'm going with Deebo. But like if you are worried about the Deebo workload, worried about maybe him somehow being like a late scratch on Sunday Night Football, and then you're kind of stuck with Pearsall or Warren, then I would go with Marvin Harrison Jr., who I think is like a fine option there. But in general, all things equal, I would go with Deebo. Sterling Shepard, worth a look. I mean, look,
sure.
The cupboard is bare for the Buccaneers. The ball is presumably going to have to be thrown to someone. Sterling Shepard getting more playing time, and he has the hashtag shower narrative with Baker Mayfield from their time together at Oklahoma in college. So is he worth a look? Sure. I have him as my wide receiver 54. So in deep formats, he's worth entertaining if you're kind of desperate and just looking for someone on the waiver wire and it's a deep league. Sure. I would hope you could find another wide receiver who is better.
Cedric Tillman.
Yes. I would hope that you could use someone like Cedric Tillman. Someone like that, I think is like the perfect candidate of like, okay, I'm thinking of Sterling Shepard, or I'm thinking of this other guy who is maybe a little bit under the radar, like Ricky Pearsall. Like we just kind of mentioned him in passing. Juwan Jennings is out. Brandon Ayuk is out. Ricky Pearsall probably going to get a decent amount of playing time for the 49ers. I would go with Ricky Pearsall ahead of Sterling Shepard, but that's kind of like the realm of guys that we're thinking of who hopefully would still be available on waivers, that I would recommend going with them over Sterling Shepard. And then of course we just get the question right here from Brian Lee, full PPR flex spot, Ricky Pearsall, Pop Douglas, or Sterling Shepard. So I would say I've already established I like Pearsall ahead of Sterling Shepard. But of course, with this being full PPR, maybe that changes a little bit the way that you look at it, because I would think of Sterling Shepard as a little bit of kind of like Wan'Dale Robinson-ish, where it's like, if he gets targets, they're likely to be low ADOT. He could convert a number of those targets into really easy receptions, which maybe pays off in PPR. And you have to think similarly a little bit with Pop Douglas, who was out last week because of the illness. That just kind of randomly popped up, not entirely out of nowhere, but kind of out of nowhere. I think, he will be back fully into his established role there as the slot guy for the Patriots. So I think it's a question for me of, am I going with Pearsall, or am I going with Pop Douglas or Demario Douglas? Which one are you thinking about there?
I'd be fine going with Ricky Pearsall in this matchup, because I'm concerned about what the overall workload is going to look like for all of the Patriots receivers so far. I think with Drake May, like, it's been more of like the Hunter Henry show than anything else. So I can see a scenario like with Jalen Polk out, where like Pop Douglas like does get some of those targets, but this is but for back to the 49ers, we do know that like George Kittle's coming into this with his own like ailments, like foot injury, something along those lines. So like their pass catchers are already like banged up and or sick. I would give the edge to Ricky Pearsall, but I can understand like why, like going with the volume or potential volume for Pop Douglas coming back into that offense with Drake May. I get it though.
Yeah, and I would say like it's a projection with Pearsall. He's a rookie. This is his second NFL game. Really kind of unknown environment of how the 49ers are going to respond offensively with all of these other pass catchers out. So you can project the volume for Pearsall, but it's far from a certainty. Whereas like with Douglas, when he's healthy, you have a pretty good sense of the volume he's going to have coming in his direction. But of course, also new environment for them with the change to Drake May at quarterback. So a lot of uncertainty. I lean Pearsall, but I can see the case for Pop Douglas. All right, next question here from Chase Brown, from Joe Doherty. Chase Brown versus Najee in the standard format. So talked earlier about Najee Harris playing on Monday Night Football as a pretty big favorite at home. Love the setup for him. Going against Chase Brown, who has really made that backfield not like 100% his own, but who has claimed the lion's share of the workload for the Bengals, and now Bengals as favorites in this game. Let me see, who are 2.5 point favorites, Bengals at home against the Eagles. Where are you leaning in this spot right here?
So at least between the two of those guys, I would say that like Najee, like at least for me, would grade out as the better option. According to our DVP tool, Eagles are the 4th worst matchup like for opposing running backs, and this is also on a team where like Chase Brown like has gotten the majority of the shares, over 50% of the rushing attempts over the past like few weeks, and sitting around like a 10-ish% target share. But this is also on a team where they haven't been able to get their running backs out in space. They haven't been using them on running back screens, like things of that nature, which would really unlock Chase Brown from an explosive standpoint, which we saw him have the capability to do that when he was still at Illinois. So like without seeing like really that shift in his usage, and we already know that once the Steelers like get into scoring position, it's primarily going to be Najee Harris like running in the ball. I think it's like Harris should at least get the edge over that one. But the hope would be that the Bengals recognize Brown has that pass catching ability, but we just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I go with Najee. Like if everything goes well for the Steelers offense and Steelers favored by 6.5 at home, I think that includes Najee Harris having a pretty good game where he has like 75 to 125 yards and a touchdown. If everything goes well for the Bengals, that doesn't really mean anything for Chase Brown. Like maybe he finds the end zone, but maybe that just means like Jamar Chase has an awesome game, and there's nothing left for anyone else in that offense. So I would be leaning towards Najee there, but it's close. It's a consideration.
Sure.
Question from Steve Gherkin, 12-team half PPR, need 2 flexes. Khalil Shakir, Hunter Henry, Rome Odunze, Jalen Warren, Pop Douglas. We talked about Douglas already on the show. We talked about Odunze. We haven't talked about Shakir, Hunter Henry, and Jalen Warren. Warren is probably off of my list. I like him as a player, but as the number 2 running back there in an offense that, even though I like Najee Harris and George Pickens, that is still like a rather low ceiling offense. Like that game has a total of 36.5. Like it could be a low scoring game. Like the market is expecting a low scoring game. And so even though I think Najee Harris and Pickens could have big games, I think they're basically the only 2 in that offense that I would want exposure to. So not really interested in Jaylen Warren in this spot. Khalil Shakir, there could be some questions about how big his workload is going to be within that Bills offense now that Amari Cooper is there to steal some targets. Hunter Henry, you talked about him a little bit earlier as maybe at this point the number 1 pass catcher, the number 1 target earner for that Patriots offense. How are you looking at all of those guys there?
I would say just the 2 Patriots receivers like stuck out like quite a bit, because we were talking earlier about like Pop Douglas, his target share before he missed like last week's game. He was around like 28% of like the team's targets in the prior 2 weeks before he wound up like getting sick. So I can understand like between Pop Douglas, Hunter Henry, those being the focal points of this Drake May-led offense, like starting them, like I know it's kind of weird starting like 2 players like from the same squad, and this is like isn't like your Kansas City Chiefs, your Cincinnati, like the more efficient, higher scoring offenses that you would want to like have multiple pieces from. But I think those 2 guys, like I think they're the ones that initially stuck out, because we do have workload concerns about like each of the rest of them, like Khalil Shakir, like you mentioned with Amari Cooper, Keon Coleman, like having one of his like better games like of this season as well, like for the Bills. So like I think out of all that entire group, the Patriots guys was the one that stuck out the most.
All right, a question here from Miggy Smalls. Shout out Miggy. Better stash, Dalvin Cook or Kamani Vidal? I will just say, I have very little enthusiasm for Dalvin Cook or really any of the potential running backs there in Dallas. Because even if Dalvin Cook, even if he were the player that he used to be, which I would say like pretty clearly, I feel like he's not, there's really no guarantee that they would split the backfield in a way that just gives him the super majority of the usage there. And I feel like that is kind of what you would be looking for. So pessimistic about Dalvin Cook. Kamani Vidal, something of an unknown as a rookie, but at least what we do know is that he's in an offense that really wants to run the ball. Gus Edwards is out on IR, and so it's J.K. Dobbins as the guy in front of him. And Dobbins has been good, but Dobbins has slowed down a little bit just in terms of his efficiency since his hot start. And, you know, running back is a fragile position where guys can get injured, and J.K. Dobbins does have an injury history. I would probably go with Kamani Vidal. Where are you thinking in terms of a stash?
So maybe you might know this better than I do as a Cowboys fan, but like can Dalvin Cook, does he play offensive lineman? Does he run routes like that in the intermediate and deep parts of the field to maybe add to their pass catching core that's kind of dwindling without having like Brandon Cooks out there? Like does Dalvin Cook play a different position of need for the Cowboys that I'm not aware of? I don't see what. Yeah. Like I saw the report of them like bringing Cook like up to the active roster, and the only thing I can think of was that GIF of the guy putting the strip of duct tape over a big crack in a rock. That's all I kept thinking about. I was like, oh, that'll fix it. Yeah, that's exactly what they need. No, I'm with you. Like Kamani Vidal, like his rush attempts, like his share of the rushing attempts have slightly ticked up over the couple of weeks. Well, it was his first touch, like a touchdown, even though it was like a reception. So like the team recognizes like his utility to the offense. And also without like J.K. Dobbins hitting a lot of those explosive carries that he was like during the past few weeks, like my assumption is that they might start to switch this to more of a 2-man rotation as things start to slow down for Dobbins over the next few weeks. So I'm with you. Like Vidal should be the better stash.
All right, so a question here at the quarterback position, Tua, Richardson, or Geno Smith this week. So Geno at home as an underdog going against the Bills, Anthony Richardson going against the Texans. I believe it was week 1 against the Texans where Anthony Richardson looked like a deep throwing god, and then since then we have not so much. Yeah, we have not seen him in deity form. And then Tua, good matchup in his return going against the Cardinals here.
Yeah.
I'm with Tua in this spot. I love the theoretical upside of Anthony Richardson, but at this point, that upside feels more theoretical than actual. But we know what Tua can do, and especially with the matchup that he has going against a pretty poor Cardinals pass defense. I would be going with Tua.
Yeah, like Richardson has ranked like 20th or worst in at pretty much each level of the field from an EPA per dropback standpoint, like since he's returned to the field. Then Geno Smith, I would say the one slight tick, and everybody go and check the forecast as of right now. There's supposed to be some light wind and rain like in the area out in Seattle for this week. Not enough to like change the passing rates or anything like that. But again, just like one of those things that at least when I go through looking at game environments, that's just like one slight tick down. Don't have that concern for Tua. We know what this offense can look like with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle on the field. I think it's Tua by at least a fairly decent margin.
All right. I love this next question here from Steve Duhamel. Tua or Brock Purdy as a better option today? So I will say that I am still relatively high in our rankings on Brock Purdy. Only Waz is higher on him, but I have Brock Purdy at number 10. But Charge has him at number 16. Ian has him at 17. Dwayne has him at 14. But I still really like Brock Purdy, and it has to do with a couple of things here. One, that offense. I think that they can still manufacture some easy production for Brock Purdy the way that they kind of always have been able to do within that Kyle Shanahan scheme. And then there's the matchup against the Cowboys. Deron Bland is still not returning from IR at this point. Micah Parsons is out on that defensive line. And then Case and Carson, the other perimeter corner there for the Cowboys, it looks like he's also questionable for this game. And based on his practice patterns, I think it's likelier than not that he's out. And so I think it's still a pretty decent matchup. And then, you still are likely to have Deebo Samuel in this game. There's still a chance that you're going to have George Kittle. Ricky Pearsall is a first-round wide receiver. Like, I do think that there is enough there for Brock Purdy as a home favorite going against a Cowboys defense that is pretty suspect. I do think there's enough for Brock Purdy there. So even though I like Tua and I think Tua has a good matchup, I'm going with Purdy. Like, Tua could be rusty coming back from the time off with the concussions coming from IR. I would go with Purdy, but I can see why someone would differ in their opinion there. Where are you on this?
I'm with you. I think that Brock Purdy has I would say it's like a floor ceiling type of thing. Whereas I think Purdy has the higher floor, but then Tua offers the higher ceiling. I think given the weapons that he has going up against the Cardinals, who we know can be beat deep with either of the whether it's Waddle or Tua or even Jonnu Smith, since he popped up for that 15-ish% target share just this past week. So I'd say from a ceiling standpoint, Tua has the better outlook, but if you're just looking for the floor purposes, I would say Purdy is probably the better option between the two.
Okay. Kamara or Hopkins in standard. So we talked about Hopkins earlier and how there are, some questions here, legitimate questions as to whether he has a big role in the Chiefs offense, especially his first week with the team, the Chiefs on the road as big favorites. Maybe it's just a situation where they do not need to rely on DeAndre Hopkins to get a pretty decisive victory this week going against the Raiders. Kamara is the guy I'm pretty cleanly looking at, because if things go well for the Saints offense, and that's a question as to whether things actually would go well, but if they go well, Kamara probably ends up having a pretty big hand in that. I'm going with Kamara. Where are you?
Yeah, I'm going with Kamara. That's it. The only concern is I think he put out there he's been dealing with a broken hand over the past couple of weeks. Hasn't necessarily affected his target share. They have been on the slight decline. 25% target share back in week 5, 23% in week 6, down to 18% in week 7. So it is something to monitor going forward. But at least if you do know that we don't have the same concerns about any of the other running backs really working in behind him and taking carries away from him. So I don't have any strong workload concerns from Kamara, whereas we already laid out all the concerns for DeAndre Hopkins in his first week with Patrick Mahomes, Xavier Worthy, Travis Kelce, and also Kareem Hunt being the focal point once they get in the red zone. So I think it's Kamara at least fairly easily in this one.
Yeah, I go with Kamara. I will say, and to your point about potential concerns with Kamara, on top of the hand issue, he also has a rib issue. He did practice every day this week, but it was limited. And then I'd say maybe a bigger thing is the return of Taysom Hill, who is, like the notorious goal line vulture.
Yeah.
And so maybe that creates a situation where even if things go well for the Saints and maybe Kamara gets a decent amount of yards, maybe he doesn't get the touchdowns because that goes to Taysom Hill. But even in that scenario, I'm still going with Alvin Kamara. All right. Question here. Deebo, Waddle, or Amari Cooper. So we've already talked about Waddle earlier on the show. We have the return of Tua and uncertainty with Tyreek Hill, who's dealing with a foot injury. We believe Tyreek Hill is going to play, but that is far from a certainty here. So Waddle is interesting. We've talked about Deebo on the show playing on Sunday Night Football. I still think that Deebo is a mid-range wide receiver 2 with some potential upside given the injury to Brandon Ayuk and no Juwan Jennings there. We haven't talked about Amari Cooper yet, who last week looked great in limited usage with the Bills. And now you would expect with another week, he's just all the more integrated into that offense. Where are you on those 3, Cooper, Waddle, Deebo?
I think just if I had to rank them in order, I'd probably go Waddle and then Cooper and then Deebo. If I'm thinking about this, I still have the health concerns for Deebo, but Jalen Waddle, we already talked about him, in his usage around 28% of the team's targets over the past 2 weeks. That's without Tua. So the hope is that target, the targets condensing around those 2, that holds with Tua coming back. And then the foot thing we already talked about with for Tyreek. But I think for Amari, his first week out with Josh Allen, around a 16-17% target share, which isn't great, but at least we saw that he was being used in all areas of the field, got the touchdown pass. So the hope would be that he starts to see a bit more volume in his second week, with Josh Allen. And of course, them going up against the Seahawks secondary. They've got their Trey Brown, one of their corners, DMP with a full practice on Friday. So at least one of their corners is questionable. Nehemiah Pritchett also questionable, another one of their corners questionable. So there is a way around this the Seahawks secondary, and I think that's where Amari Cooper should be a guy like Amari Cooper should be able to shine. So I do think that there's a way that he can be the one that, at least out of those 3 guys, I think it's those 2 that I have at least the more confidence in, at least compared to Deebo.
All right. Yeah, I'm with you there. All right. So we are at the 10:07 mark. We still have some more questions that we can get to. If you are just joining us, I'm Freedman. He's Chris Allen, and we're trying to get through as many, well, maybe not as many, but a decent number of your fantasy football questions ahead of kickoff. Next one here from Justin Penkert: full PPR, McMillan or Pop Douglas? And so, yeah, this is a sign of where we are in the season. You're entering the season thinking oh, I'm going to start all of these stud wide receivers. My team is awesome. Everyone is going to lose when they play me. And then in week 8, you're sweating out McMillan or Pop Douglas. That's where we are. But I mean, Jalen McMillan, great scenario set up for him. No Mike Evans, no Chris Godwin. Both of those guys are out for this game versus Pop Douglas. Where are you?
I don't know. I would say that I would lean towards Jalen McMillan. My only question is he going to get the coveted slot role for the Bucs? But if we do know I think from a talent standpoint, McMillan grades out as the better wide receiver, over Pop Douglas, and also the point in McMillan's favor is the Bucs were one of the more pass friendly offenses in the league as compared to where they were where the Patriots are at with Drake May. So I'd say from a team offensive situation standpoint, I lean towards the Bucs because Baker Mayfield has been slinging all over the field. McMillan, from a talent standpoint, we do know with him coming out of that Washington Huskies offense, he would be one of the premier talents from a wide receiver standpoint that we'd want to try at least bank on that in his collegiate production. So I do think that McMillan is probably the better option here. But again, we just don't know how this offense is going to look without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin in it.
Yeah, I go with McMillan there. He has the ability to play inside and outside. I think the kind of full slot role is probably going to go to Sterling Shepard. Just like he's more of a slot bound, limited kind of wide receiver, just in terms of like overall usage. But I do think we see McMillan go into the slot occasionally, but play a little more on the outside. All right, next question here. Calvin Ridley or Nick Chubb, full PPR? Thank you. All right. So we haven't talked about either one of these guys. Ridley, within an offense that is just absolutely tanking at this point. Mason Rudolph coming in as quarterback. No DeAndre Hopkins. I would say Mason Rudolph upgrade, pretty strong upgrade on Will Levis. Like Mason Rudolph is at least like a professional quarterback. Mason Rudolph actually 10-4 against the spread for his career, like exceeding expectations. Maybe some of that is just the fact that he was with the Steelers, and the Steelers tend to exceed expectations when they are underdogs. And when Mason Rudolph is your quarterback, you are an underdog. And we definitely see that in this game. The Titans underdogs of 11.5 points on the road going against the Lions. But Calvin Ridley, no DeAndre Hopkins, upgraded quarterback, maybe a decent setup for him versus Nick Chubb, who is an 8.5 point underdog against the Ravens. Ravens pretty tough against the run. But of course, with no Deshaun Watson at quarterback for the Browns, maybe we see them rely a little bit more on the ground game. With this being Nick Chubb's second game back, maybe he gets a little more usage than he had last week. And, with no Deshaun Watson, maybe that offense is actually better. Maybe it's an upgrade to go to Jameis Winston from Deshaun Watson. We actually do have that projected as an upgrade in terms of against the spread value. Where are you thinking you would want to go in this matchup?
Lean towards Nick Chubb. Like, to your point, the Ravens are sitting like right around like the league average, like they're slightly behind in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position, around like 21.5. And it was good to see like Nick Chubb in his first game back just this past week against the Bengals, like over 50% of the team's carries. So at least from a utilization standpoint, I think Chubb grades out as the better option between the two, because there's just at least right now, the Titans have not shown at least any sort of like confidence or like the willingness to really make like Calvin Ridley the focal point of their offense. Like, he's been talking about it, like in the, like to beat reporters and things of that nature of, they need to get me the ball more, need to get me the ball sooner. And even with DeAndre Hopkins, like out of the picture, we don't know if they're going to try and if today's going to be like the Nick Westbrook-Akine show or things along the, like things of that nature. So it's like, I'm more willing to put my eggs in the Nick Chubb basket, because we do know that workload is going to be there for him as compared to Calvin Ridley for this game. But let's see how things like develop with the changing in the Titans passing game. But I'm with Nick Chubb on this one.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one too. All right, a question from Brock. Who is the better handcuff for Javonte, McLaughlin or Estime? Thanks, fellas. You are welcome, Brock. Interesting question here, because McLaughlin has already a built-in role, an established role within that offense. But there's just the question of, does he actually see that role expand if Javonte is injured? I don't think the role actually expands all that much. Like, it expands a little bit, but I think he pretty much is already close to the ceiling of his potential within that offense. I think if Javonte were out, Audric Estime, the rookie, would end up becoming kind of like the main like 2-down grinder, like the early down back, and McLaughlin's role would probably expand a little, but not much. What are your thoughts on this one?
I would agree with that, in the sense that we would see Javonte's role more split out between the two. Estime, like given his size and stature, works into the early down, maybe short yardage grinder type of role. Jaleel McLaughlin, like while he has also been used on early downs, could then mix in like 2-minute situations, obvious passing situations. So none of the touches really condense around one player, where we've seen Javonte kind of be spread out across all of the roles and facets of the running back position. But I would say that I would give the edge to Estime, because we can at least project, or at least lean on the idea that if they were to get inside the 5, those touches would go to Estime. But there's really no, I can't project how often that's going to happen, like with it being a Bo Nix led offense. Not going to be playing the Panthers like every week.
Exactly. So, what I would say is, like, I think there are a couple of questions here. Like, one is, who ends up kind of replacing a lot of the Javonte role. And I think that's Estime. To your point, I think it does get split out a little bit more. But I think a concern or something else to take into account when thinking about this is not just who ends up becoming the guy if this one thing happens, but like the odds of that one thing happening. And like if that one thing doesn't happen, at least if you have Jaleel McLaughlin, like at some points you have a flexible player. Like you have someone who can do something for you right now versus Audric Estime, who you're holding basically just hoping that he ends up having this surge of value that is realized later in the event of an injury. So even though I think Estime is kind of like the quote unquote handcuff, McLaughlin is probably the guy I would rather roster because at least right now he's still week to week potentially able to flex in for me if I really need that. So I would go with McLaughlin as the guy that, even though he's maybe not like the pure quote unquote handcuff, he's the guy that I would rather roster out of the two.
I like that. Yeah.
All right. Question from John Martin, PPR flex spot, Diggs or Javonte. So we just talked about Javonte there kind of theoretically. All right. I like, let me see. We're drying out if you want. Okay. All right. Diggs is the number one receiver at this point for that Houston Texans offense, but it is an offense that isn't really functioning at full capacity because it's missing its number one wide receiver, and Diggs maybe really no longer capable of being the full-blown number one wide receiver that we saw when he was with Buffalo. Javonte is a guy that I wrote up for my running back piece this week. Absolutely love the spot for him. Talked about it earlier when we talked about Bo Nix. It's basically the similar situation. Broncos, massive favorites at home, even though we saw Audric Estime return from IR. Williams has maintained his lead role for the Broncos. 7.7 utilization score, 65% snap rate over the past 2 weeks. Over the past month, 49 carries, 18 targets. He's leveraged that into 338 yards and 2 touchdowns from scrimmage. The Broncos, 3 extra days of rest coming off of Thursday Night Football from last week. So Williams should be rested. The team should be ready. Big home favorite against a Panthers defense that, oh my word, just absolutely terrible. The Panthers, number 32 in defensive rush DVOA, missing about half of the starting defense. So just a bad defense and a wounded defense. Javonte Williams in a total smash spot. And this line has moved from like 4.5 a week ago to now like 10.5. Like it is just absolutely cleared out going towards the Broncos. So yes, with Javonte in this spot, but where are you thinking?
No, you would have to pay me. I don't even know how much you could pay me in order to get Javonte out of my starting lineup. The last time that the Panthers didn't allow a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back was all the way back in week 3, and that was against Samir White. Everybody has gotten into the box against the Panthers. Both Atlanta running backs found the end zone against them, had like multiple 100-yard games like throughout the season as well. Like I think this is an easy spot for me to say like Javonte Williams should be the guy that you should be starting.
All right, final question here from Daniel Caps, and we appreciate everyone who has stuck around and asked questions. It is a real thrill to look through the slate on Sunday morning every week with all of y'all. All right, Daniel Caps with the question here: Caleb or Bo Nix? Talked about Bo Nix earlier at the top of the show. Absolutely love the spot for him, but of course, Caleb Williams, great spot for him too, right? He is going against a Commanders defense that is still, even though it's improved recently, still one of the worst in the league, especially against the pass. Caleb Williams, coming out of the bye week, has gotten better progressively each week of the year. And so a pretty good matchup for him. Where are you looking to invest here?
Caleb Williams is probably the easiest of the between the two. I know that we talk about like going against the Panthers defense. You always want to start as many assets against the Panthers defense as possible. We just talked about how better of a matchup it is for a guy like Javonte Williams in order for him to have a good rushing production day. And we really haven't talked too much about the pass catchers associated with the Broncos. It's always been about like Audric Estime, Jaleel McLaughlin, like Javonte Williams. And really, like we had one question about Cortland Sutton, really not anybody else, like not even the tight ends that people are trying to fit in. So I think that kind of gives you a qualitative value about where we're at, like for Bo Nix. Yes, he can run, but is he necessarily going to run once they get into the red zone? TBD. But for Caleb Williams and going up against the Commanders, I mean, allowing at least like one passing touchdown in every game, like over the past 3 to 4 weeks, Caleb Williams has looked like really strong as a passer, like limiting the negative plays, like while still he has taken like some sacks here and there, but at least he's been scrambling a bit more, able to get passes out like beyond the sticks, working in Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, and of course DJ Moore. I think it should be Caleb Williams like fairly easily in this one.
Yeah, I mean, talked about Bo Nix earlier. I just absolutely love the spot of going against the Panthers. By the way, the Panthers, the most profitable team this year to bet against. Their opponents are 6-1 against the spread. The only team that hasn't covered by margin going against the Panthers, the terrible Raiders. But yeah, love the spot. That said, absolutely right. I think Caleb Williams is the one that I would go with. A tough first 2 weeks of the season. He had just 2.7 adjusted yards per attempt. Since then, man, he's improved incrementally. And it's like you can see the growth. Since week 3, 8.2 adjusted yards per attempt. He's still doing some good work on the ground. And again, coming out of the week 7 bye, normally with rookie quarterbacks, we see something of like a reset or like an amplification with those guys coming out of the bye week. And so given the trajectory that we already saw out of Caleb Williams entering the bye week, coming out of the bye with a great matchup against the Commanders, who are number 29 in defensive dropback success rate, great spot for Caleb Williams. So love Bo Nix, but Caleb Williams is the guy that I would be starting in that head-to-head matchup there. All right, Chris, this was a lot of fun. We are about halfway through the season, not quite halfway through, but halfway through the NFL season, over halfway through the fantasy season. We hope that this has been useful for everyone joining. Great thrill every Sunday to get through your fantasy football questions. So for Chris, for the producer, Nando,